So Fred Turner is an associate professor of communication and the director of the program in science, technology, and society at Stanford University. You may know of his book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, but more recently, and out in our lobby, we have his book, in the hall. Oh, I'm sorry, right here in the hall. We have The Democratic Surround, Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s. So we're going to look back through the previous century, what made the culture that we live in today. So please give a big hand to Fred Turner.
Great, thank you. Great. Oh, thank you all for turning out tonight. I am completely psyched to be here. I'm especially psyched to be in the nice, cool room. But I'm also psyched to be back here particularly. One of the things that I think I do for a living is the cultural history of media and media technology. As I said to some folks at dinner, I come from an intellectual milieu in which when you say to someone, say to some of the historians that I run with, what's the really important stuff in the 20th century? They look at you and they get all misty-eyed and they say, Roosevelt. And my mission in life is to say, well, yeah, okay, fine, Roosevelt, but how about computers? How about television? How about cinema? Okay. So for some time now, about a decade, I've been involved in trying to do a kind of cultural history of the multimedia world we inhabit. And tonight I'm going to take you back through a piece of that through my new book, The Democratic Surround. I'm just going to pass it around. It has some cool pictures in it. Definitely look at those. I'll show you some on the screen, but this is just a pass around copy. Enjoy. Okay. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. If you have questions of fact, please jump right in. More conceptual questions, if you could hold those, that would be great because we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. As someone who's been alone in a room for 5 years with a book, I'm completely thrilled to talk about this stuff. So we can go as long as you like. Okay. I'm going to talk in 3 parts. I'm going to start by trying to anchor the history I'm about to tell in our contemporary moment. I'm going to make a case that we live at a time when we are surrounded by screens, and not simply surrounded, but offered a way of being a person in relation to screens that we associate with digital media. But then I'm going to argue that that way of being with screens did not, in fact, emerge alongside digital media or the many screens that we now carry with us, but rather emerged in World War II in a desperate effort to push back here in the United States on what American thinkers, journalists, technologists, artists believed as a group was the threat of fascism, and most particularly of mass media technologies that they believed at that time could quite literally turn audiences in a fascist direction. So I'll go back to World War II, which is the sort of beginning moment of the book. I'll tell you some stories from that period and try to talk about what I'm going to call the democratic surround, a multimedia environment explicitly designed to produce democratic people. Then we'll follow that form up 2 streams, and I'm going to sort of race through the back half of the book. One stream leads through Cold War propaganda, straight up through multimedia environments, large exhibitions, overseas shows, all designed to turn foreign peoples, potentially allies or potential enemies, in the case of the Soviets, into democratic citizens, or at least sympathizers with the democratic mission. The other place I'm going to trace the story is up through the art world, a world that we tend to think of having nothing to do with propaganda, the state, especially during the Cold War. I'm going to follow these ideas of the surround through the work of John Cage, the aleatoric Buddhist composer, up through Black Mountain College, home of American avant-garde, and then on up into the 60s and a kind of deep countercultural psychedelia that some of you may have known. Let me just do a quick check. Younger people, close your eyes. How many of you how many of you have actually been to a multimedia environment of some kind? Excellent. Okay. And the second question. It's interesting the folks didn't raise their hands. You all been to raves? No. Okay. Coming back to you. Pardon? We'll say it out loud. That's why would I admit that? That's great. Okay, good. But that's a generational difference too, right? Because if we go back a generation, multimedia spaces were spaces in which folks tended to believe that you could actually reform yourself and reform your social world by partying. It was a great era. The 60s were excellent. But this is intriguing, right? I started this book as a prequel to my last book, and it's a book that I started by asking, how was it that we came to believe, alongside Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s, that surrounding ourselves with visual images, with swirling light shows, that dropping acid, that being together and dancing would actually reform society. How did we come to believe that? So this book is, in some ways, an answer to that question. So I will conclude in the late 1960s and then with some ruminations about their legacy for our time today. So that's where we're headed. Let me start with what I've started to call Facebook Nation. So I look around the room right here. I see cell phones, tablets, laptops. I get on an airplane. There's screens on the back of the seat in front of me. It makes me insane. There's screens overhead sometimes. If I look out the window, I love this at SFO. When you get on an airplane at SFO, you look out the window at the 101, and there's a giant LED screen broadcasting at you through your window, okay? These screens are not only all around us, but they carry with them a set of ideas about what kinds of people we ought to be. These screens are highly individualized. The cell phone, the Google Glass, designed on the one hand for hypermobile, hyper-individualized citizens who are fully in control of their own mobility. At the same time, these technologies are designed to help link us into, at least ostensibly, non-hierarchical groups. We're supposed to be able to gather, to connect with our friends, to socialize. Okay? This is very different than, for example, to form a corporation or build an institution or join a hospital. We're supposed to be able to connect, collaborate, be at ease with one another. That form of connection around a kind of hyper-individualized self is enabled not only by the technologies, but by the corporate sector. This is a highly commercialized social space. It's a space in which, sure, you connect with your friends, but you do so through a service provided by a commercial vendor, and you don't think twice about it. It's not state-sponsored. The French tried to build a state-sponsored system years ago, didn't work out so well. This is, we're not connecting through, NASA book. Wouldn't that be neat, though, if we did? Okay, but you see where I'm going with this, right? It's Facebook. So, a hyper-individualized mode of society in which we collaborate and live together in an egalitarian way with the benevolent support not only of technologies and multi-screen environments, but corporations that sustain those environments and that interact with us that way. That world we tend to think of as having come on the heels of social media and the rise of the personal computer. That's not actually where it comes from. And the difference is important. Brief background. Christian kindly mentioned my last book. It's called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. In that book, I followed Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog crew and their impact on Wired Magazine and on how we think about computing. Some of you may know, if you're on the Well or other places, that it was folks associated with the Whole Earth world who brought us the following terms: virtual community, personal computer, electronic frontier. They were enormously influential. They carried with them ideals from the 1960s into the 1990s that shaped our understanding of what computers could be. I can go deep on that in the Q&A if that's helpful. So after I finished that book, I still had a mystery on my hands. The mystery was this. I grew up at a time when the 1960s were depicted to me as the quintessential cultural revolution. It's the time when finally our black and white America turned technicolor. Finally we could overthrow those dull, leave it to Beaver, father knows best kind of worlds and build something new. So what I couldn't figure out was, how were all these people I'd been interviewing and writing about from the 60s reading so much from the 1940s? What were they doing reading Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, or Erich Fromm, the psychologist, or Maslow, the psychologist? Why were they reading that stuff? What was it they were getting? And that query led me to write this book, which is very clearly a prequel to the counterculture book. It's called The Democratic Surround. It starts in the late 1930s, ends in the late 1960s. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me take you back to a time that was a time I certainly knew nothing about growing up. My guess is even the oldest among you here tonight won't remember this time either. America, around 1938. American intellectuals and American artists and American political leaders have an enormous problem in 1938. They are terrified. Germany has turned fascist. Until the 30s, many American intellectuals regarded Germany as the home of European intellectual life, even more than Paris. They brought us Beethoven, they brought us Hegel, They brought us the Romantic poets, the German Romantic poets, Heine and the like. How was it that this incredibly sophisticated jewel of a nation had fallen so hard for this short, mustachioed, seemingly crazy former clerk, Adolf Hitler? How did that happen? So American intellectuals and journalists got very active in trying to figure that out. And the answer they came up with is an intriguing one. They began to theorize that mass media had helped bring Hitler to power. Two ways. First, they thought that German leaders were clinically insane, okay, like just completely bonkers. But that somehow the media, the mass media that they had taken advantage of, radio, cinema, even newspapers, had the ability to transmit their self-evident madness into the minds of America and into every home. That's one theory. The other theory, and this was even more common, was that there was something about mass media themselves that could bypass the reason in your mind and reach down into what was just then discovered as the unconscious. Remember, Freud had only been in the US about 30 years, and stir that unconscious up and cause you to be filled with desire and longing for a leader. Oops, sorry. You know, if you write history, right, you live in a fantasy world at least some of the time. It's sad, but true. The power of mass media was such that, and I had no idea of this until I started reading magazines, people actually worried that Franklin Roosevelt was himself a fascist. Franklin Roosevelt was frequently called the fourth fascist in publications like the Atlantic Monthly, or The Nation, or Harper's. Why? Because, the theory went, he was manipulating radio via these fireside chats to turn people's emotions in his direction and get them to line up behind his program for the centralization of the American state, which they saw as fascist. This fear is very rampant, and it gets even wilder at the start of World War I. So, let me just make sure, I'm going to just check my slides, make sure I've got which ones come up. Yeah, great. So the second problem is that fascism hasn't hit only Germany. It's also threatening here in the United States. You may not know, I certainly didn't until I did this book, that in 1939, 22,000 Americans rallied on behalf of fascism in Madison Square Garden, the center of Jewish New York. In October 1939, 1,000 Americans marched down East 86th Street carrying American flags interspersed with swastikas, wearing their own imitation brown shirt uniforms, and they were not booed. There are pictures of this in the book. You can see them in the first chapter of the book. Crowds stood along the sides and watched after Hitler went into Poland. Now, chances are you all know Humphrey Bogart from Casablanca, yeah? Okay. How many of you have seen The Black Legion? I didn't even know about this movie. Middle of the night, I'm watching TV. Part of being a historian is being up in the middle of the night. At least my version of it. And there comes Humphrey Bogart. The Black Legion is a movie that he made in 1937 in which he was a black shirt American fascist who killed his Polish neighbor and regretted it. Totally forgotten film. Fascinating. You know, the support for fascism in the US was far more widespread than I think everyone admits at this point. You may have heard of a demagogue named Father Coughlin. He was on the radio very regularly. He promoted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a fascist tract. He had 3.5 million listeners every week. The Gallup organization did a poll of his listeners and found that in any given week, 65% of them agreed with his fascist views. That's a lot of Americans at that period. You may not know, and again, I certainly had no idea, that there were Nazi summer camps on Long Island. I know, it's just like you can't even make this stuff up, right? Camp Siegfried. Take your family out, dress them in Nazi uniforms, picnic. I mean, there are pictures in Life magazine of kids at Camp Siegfried learning the fascist salute. It's an astonishing thing. So Sinclair Lewis wrote, in his famous title, It Can Happen Here. And that's exactly what the fear was in the United States. And that presents a problem as the war starts. When World War II gets underway, American political leaders and American intellectuals face a really serious challenge. How are they going to encourage American citizens to mobilize against fascism without turning them into fascists? How are they going to do it? Well, one thing they were going to do is they were going to try to figure out how to promote what they called the democratic character. Some of you who may have taken sociology in college will have heard of the authoritarian personality. It's a concept that's bubbled through a lot of American thought since the 50s. Its opposite was this thing, the democratic character. I'll say more about it in a little bit. There was a theory, particularly among anthropologists, that every nation state had its own natural character. The German character appeared at the start of World War II to be especially strong, fortified, massified, fascist, but very powerful. So the question was, how could we make a democratic version of this that was equivalently strong? Now, some people said, in Roosevelt's circle, let's just go ahead, we'll use mass media. Goebbels is doing an excellent job in Germany, we'll imitate what he's doing, and we'll deprogram them later. Okay, it was that explicit. I mean, I've seen the documents. I spent way too long in the National Archives in Maryland. It's astonishing. You just can't believe you're reading it. But there's another group centered around Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, a whole series of American intellectuals, Kurt Lewin, refugee intellectual in New York, called the Committee for National Morale. Long forgotten, incredibly influential, and really a fascinating group. They come together in New York to try to figure out an answer to this problem. They want to know how we can develop media that will produce democratic people, not fascists. Democratic morale, not fascist mass morale. They're led by an art historian named Arthur Upham Pope. It always gives me cheer to think of art historians leading political movements. It just seems so right, you know? It just seems like, yeah, exactly. Imagine how much better the aesthetics of like the Republican Democratic debates would be if art historians were their campaign managers. So the Committee for National Morale worked with two key ideas. The first idea was the one that you see here. So a number of the members of the committee were psychologists, most notably Gordon Allport, who was on the faculty at Harvard, very eminent in his day. They believed that a democratic character could be defined and that it could be the basis of a collaborative mode of morale. There are two key words here. The first word is personality. In the 1940s, American intellectuals believed that something inside you was going to be the center of resistance to fascism. Now, we tend to think that the personal became political in the 1960s. I'm here to tell you that's not true. The personal becomes political right here. Personality is the tool against which we can counterpose fascism. The second word that's really important here is coordination. You'll remember when I was talking about Facebook Nation, I was talking about a kind of leveled, collaborative world. For the scholars and journalists of the Committee for National Morale, the goal was not to build a new hierarchy. That was fascistic. The goal was not to exercise control. Rather, the goal was to coordinate free individuals, to help you feel your freedom ever more powerfully and to coordinate that freedom into some kind of group action or morale. How to do that? Well, with media. But rather than make media that were mass media, the Committee for National Morale theorized that we needed multimedia environments. Because what was the essence of the democratic personality after all? But the ability to choose. So the theory went that you, a democratic citizen, needed not to have media beamed at you, but rather needed to practice selecting images, sounds, things that were meaningful for you from your environment and knitting them together into your own individual self. That individual self, made stronger by the practice of knitting things together, would then be able to collaborate with others like you. So Margaret Mead actually put it in a really interesting way. Mead was working on food stuff at this time, and she said, look, other cultures are restaurant cultures. They all just want to eat the same thing. We're Americans. We're diverse. We're a cafeteria culture. And we need a cafeteria media to match. So, fortunately for us, I think, these folks were not by and large media makers. They were sociologists, journalists, and the like. But running around in New York at the very same moment that they were meeting were half a dozen unemployed Bauhaus artists. And they had a very refined, highly developed understanding of multimedia technology that they had actually developed in the 1920s in Germany and brought with them when they fled Hitler in the middle 1930s. This is a diagram by Herbert Bayer. You may know Herbert Bayer, particularly if you work on typefaces and graphics at all. He's the one who developed the all lowercase typeface at the Bauhaus that we now use ubiquitously. He also would go on to help develop Aspen, Colorado into the center of conferencing and research that it is today. When he came to the US, he brought with him this diagram and this mode of exhibition. So this is a diagram called 360-degree fields of vision, and it's a diagram that is simply a diagram of how to hang pictures in a museum. I know, so right, exactly. Like, so it's funny, right? In our own time, we would never think of how to hang pictures in a museum as a powerful political act. But in his time, this is a very radical thing to do. In his time, pictures, by and large, there's some exceptions, and I can talk about them in Q&A if you like, but by and large, pictures are hung just like these signs here. You're meant to go up in a gallery, see an image, have a one-on-one encounter, move up to the next one, have another one-on-one encounter, on up down the line, okay? This is radical. This is totally different. As you can see, Bayer thinks of your whole head as an eye. And he wants you to take images from all around, knit them into your experience, and make yourself a whole new person on that account. He develops this idea in the late 1920s in Weimar, Germany, because he believes that this practice, this perceptual practice, will make you stronger, more resilient against the predations of chaos in economic chaos in Weimar, Germany. When he gets to the United States, he's broke, he's lonely, he's desperately in need of work. And he says, this way of making the new German might actually be an excellent way to make the new democratic citizen. And he meets up with members of the Committee for National Morale, and they in fact begin to collaborate in all kinds of interesting ways. Some of the collaborations don't take. One of the things that I found in the Museum of Modern Art archives in New York that just blew me away was I found a whole pile of notes and drawings for a new building at MoMA that would be a three-dimensional, multimedia, sound, light, picture, movies, and get this, smells, environment devoted to American patriotism. It was spectacular. It was great. You were supposed to walk through this three-story building. It was going to cost $750,000. Amy, what is Mrs. Rockefeller's first name? I'm just not remembering it. Abby. Abby Rockefeller, who funded the museum, said, no, you can't have that building. It's too close to fascist. It's too cinematic. It's like, that's interesting, too oppressive. So what folks in New York could have, though, was this, the Road to Victory. The Road to Victory is a photography exhibition, a propaganda exhibition, mounted in 1942, staged by Edward Steichen, a famous early 20th century photographer who would later go on to organize The Family of Man, which was based on this show. And if you look at it, right, to us, to our eyes, it may not look that, strange. But to eyes in 1942, this is incredibly radical. So you walk in, this is the entrance here. You walk in, you see these giant landscape portraits, huge heads of Native Americans. Again, we might see the racism and the cliches here, the stereotypes. 1942, not so much. This is text by Carl Sandburg, who is Edward Steichen's brother-in-law. You enter this space, and you can see that you're surrounded by images. Here's Pearl Harbor, an explosion at Pearl Harbor. That's Tojo giggling down below. War, they asked for it. By God, they'll get it. Clearly propagandistic, clearly pushing, but in a way that's deeply environmental. Let me just see what's going on. This is what the show's installation looked like above. It was a road that you walked through. Now, in our own time, we might feel very sort of oppressed, right, having to walk down this road. But viewers at the time took a very, very different view of this. I'd like to read you just a couple of things that visitors to the show said in the time. Here's the New York Times photography critic, art critic, Edward Alden Jewell. I think no one can see the exhibition without feeling that he is part of the power of America. It's this inescapable sense of identity, the individual spectator identifying himself with the whole, that makes the event so moving. This gave people the chance to imagine themselves embracing this whole view of America, just in the way that Bayer, who designed the show, suggested. This is my favorite quote here. This is from Elizabeth McCausland from Springfield, Illinois. She said, "Road to Victory does not mold the visitor's opinions, for that word smacks of the fascist concept of dominating men's minds." This was a three-dimensional model of freedom, one through which you could walk, built out of a visual aesthetic derived from the Bauhaus, and a psychological mission developed by the Committee for National Morale. And this is what I mean by the book's title when I say democratic surround. Now, those of you who work in electronic and digital environments may be wondering why this is multimedia. It's not yet. Right now, it's screens up on the walls, it's text here and there. Very rapidly, though, over the next 20 years, these kinds of image environments would be supplemented by sound environments, by musical environments, by performance environments. They became enormously diverse. And all of the elements that we associate with multimedia today, the multiple screens, the different stimuli, everything except the digital technology would come into being and be in place by the late 1960s. Wow, you know you're speaking in a good place when they have 3 bottles of water. So let me take a moment right now and track the migration of this cultural form, the democratic surround, up to the 1960s down 2 routes. The first route I'm going to walk through is the world of propaganda. Today we might think of propaganda as something that we do through newspapers or the web or through messaging. In the 1950s, America was enormously involved in building overseas 3-dimensional environments that were designed to produce in alien peoples the same psychological sensations that the road to victory was designed to produce in American citizens. Pro-American, pro-democratic, pro-individualist experiences. So I'll walk through those first, but at the very same time, and I'll come back to this in a moment, those environments are also being built in art worlds. Art worlds led by John Cage, by Buckminster Fuller, by figures at the Black Mountain College. Art worlds whose artists are themselves contributing to the propaganda exposition. Another myth that I was raised on, you might have been raised on it too, is cultural avant-gardes in the 1950s were separate from the state. They lived a separate life. They were special. They lived at Black Mountain. They were Beats. They hung out in North Beach. That's true for some folks, but it's certainly not true for Buckminster Fuller or John Cage. All right, so here's a country we've been spending way too much time in lately, Afghanistan. This is 1956. This is actually the first multimedia exhibition conducted overseas for purposes of transforming a foreign populace. The story behind this is kind of a fun one. That's a Buckminster Fuller dome. This is a trade fair called the Jeshen International Trade Fair. And we went to it as a nation because China and Russia were already there. China and the Soviet Union had each built huge, huge exposition spaces. And the United States Information Agency, our overseas propaganda wing, said, hey, we've got to get in this game. We've got to actually get in this game. So they called Buckminster Fuller. He had this up and running very shortly, and it was pretty effective. But what's really intriguing about this is the psychological power here. So I had an archival experience, which is very rare. I found a smoking gun. I found a declassified document in the National Archives in Maryland that outlined the psychological strategy for these environments, including this one. The strategy was this. It said, we must regard the multimedia environments we build as therapeutic interventions on the international scene. We must study the psychological conditions of the target peoples. We must then create multimedia spaces which will intervene in that condition and move them in a more pro-democratic direction. And then finally, we must test the people just after they've had this experience to see if our intervention has worked. It's very explicit. It's a policy document, USIA policy document. I was shocked. So this is the first time it happens. This is the Afghani space, and this is the test. Yeah, go for it. So that's the United States Information Agency. Sure, oh, sorry. Who is defining that policy? So that was the United States Information Agency. It's a policy document. Those documents are unsigned, but they're official agency documents, which means they've been read at least high enough levels to be approved as an official policy document. But they're not signed. And in fact, there was a lot of debate within the USIA about whether they ought to be engaged in this or not. That was another piece that I found really interesting. It wasn't a monolithic view. This is super intriguing. I actually got this from the guy who managed the fair. This is the first time we tried to do it. Someone in the USIA did these drawings. After the Afghan men, and they were all men, had been to the show, they would be shown these drawings and asked, which reaction most closely approximates your feelings about the show and the United States? Now, I don't know if you can interpret these. I can't. Your government dollar is hard at work. I mean, it's just, I mean, sort of surprise and bewilderment, humor, want to sell you opium poppies. I don't know. I mean, the middle one, it's like, it's eek. But these are sketches designed to measure international reaction. The process of intervening and monitoring got enormously more sophisticated very rapidly. This is 1959 at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. This is where the kitchen debates occurred. You may remember when Khrushchev and Nixon face off in the kitchen. The kitchen in which they face off is down to the right down there. The space was incredible. What happened was that Khrushchev said, hey, if you Americans give us a space for an exhibition in Manhattan, we'll give you a space for an exhibition in Moscow. Instantly, the American government jumped on it. We did actually, there was a huge exhibition of Soviet things in New York, moderately successful. This show drew 2.5 million people in the months that it was open. The best, hottest ticket in Russia. Also, without a doubt, the most closely monitored show ever staged. This is a geodesic dome, a glittering golden geodesic dome created by Buckminster Fuller. It's more than 200 feet across. These are 7 screens hung from the ceiling by the Eames, Ray and Charles Eames. Each screen is about 33 feet across, 33 feet long. It's a show called Glimpses of the USA. And it's designed to produce in Soviet citizens both a knowledge in the intellectual sense and a sensation of American abundance. The Eames have looked extensively at Herbert Bayer's designs. They want to create a multi-screen environment that will help Russians, Soviets in particular, appreciate the abundance of America. But it's not just abundance. I found another document. This was really good. I actually found 3. These were in the Museum of Modern Art documents in the archives. There were 3 documents. One was labeled confidential, one was labeled secret, one was labeled top secret. They had exactly 1 sentence difference between them. It was fascinating. The first confidential document said, we want to create a multimedia environment that will show the Soviets how abundant America is. Not so controversial. Second, we want to create a multimedia environment that will cause the Soviets to realize how febrile their own economy is. Third document, we want to show them a multimedia environment that will show them how abundant we are, how febrile their economy is, and get them to overthrow their own government. It was just incredible, just incredible. This is in the Museum of Modern Art, these documents. Just amazing materials. So here we are, this is that environment. Now, this is what it looked like when you entered the space. Those are Soviet visitors down below. That's a little piece of the family of man. The family of man was there. There were all kinds of consumer shows there. There were automobiles. I don't know if there were automobiles. There were sailboats. There were all kinds of consumer goods. You can see the screens from Glimpses of the USA above. What you can't see so much is the amazing monitoring that was going on here. I'm sorry, pardon? Yes, projection screens. Projection screens, thanks. Yeah, I don't think there were TV screens that did that at that time. I don't know. I don't know. Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay, yeah, no, projection screens. Thank you. Good question. So here we're still at the fair. This is the IBM Raymac computer, which was on display there. And it was touted as having been pre-programmed with answers to 4,000 questions about America. And Soviet citizens were taught to go up, ask the translator, this is the translator here, a question about America. He would type something into the computer, and the computer would give an answer. Miracle. Okay. The funny thing is, the real purpose of the computer is to record the questions. Yeah, okay. The American National Exhibition was an environment devoted to the monitoring of Soviet citizens. Remember that in 1959, we didn't know too much about the Soviets. So we set up the exhibition. We hired 20 American college students to be translators and to talk to Soviets. The Soviets were blown away. You let your college students just talk to us? Well, it turns out the college students were remembering everything they were told and debriefing at the end of every day. There were comment books scattered around, chained to different posts, scattered around the fair. Soviets would write their comments. The comments were duly transcribed at the end of every day and sent back to the United States Information Agency in Washington. USIA agents collected every scrap of press about the show across the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe. And lucky for me, they gathered it all in the National Archives. So it was all there. It was simply astonishing. This was an environment that was designed to do to Soviet citizens what the Road to Victory exhibition had been designed to do to Americans, democratize them, give them the experience of selecting from a world of choices the different elements that would become part of their own identity. Some of those elements were mediated, but now by 1959, they also included consumer goods. So that's kind of the propaganda story in a nutshell, and I can go deep on any point during the question and answer period. There's a second parallel story, which again I had known nothing about, and which I ended up feeling very ambivalent about. And it's a story that starts with John Cage. John Cage is a composer, an aleatoric composer. He believed in breaking down traditional symphonic music and helping you hear the sounds of the world around you. And he's most famous, I think, for the work he did after the early 1950s. In the early 1950s, he took a famous turn intellectually toward the East, became very involved in Eastern religion and thinking about Buddhism, and has frequently been seen as a kind of pacifist. Well, I went back to his papers from the early 40s, and he's a very different creature. In the 1940s, Cage is in New York. He's married at that time to a woman, and he's gonna duck out of the draft, arguing that his wife has an injured leg. I've seen pictures of her all through that period. No sign of an injury that I can spot, but whatever. But he buys deeply into the political mission of the Democratic Surround. He argues that aesthetic, particularly the aesthetics of sound, are a way to begin to produce democracy here in America. And he makes that argument in part because in 1940 and 41, he has an extended encounter with the Bauhaus. In 1941, he actually teaches for a year in the new Bauhaus in Chicago. And he buys deeply into the surround aesthetic, and he buys deeply into the patriotic aesthetic. This is Cage writing in 1939. Percussion music is revolution. Sound and rhythm have too long been submissive to the restrictions of 19th century music. Today, we are fighting for their emancipation. Tomorrow, with electronic music in our ears, we will hear freedom. The conscientious objectors to modern music will, of course, attempt everything in the way of counter-revolution, but the American army would march on. It's fascinating to hear Cage sort of promote this kind of macho rhetoric because he was such a non-macho guy and was himself, I would argue, a draft dodger. So Cage begins doing things here, you can see here, like taking a piano and sticking bits of felt and metal between the strings and turning it into a sound production device as opposed to a traditional music production device. He works with the Bauhaus, with Bauhaus people, and gradually, together with some of them, he migrates to Black Mountain College. Now, you may know Black Mountain College as the home of the Cold War avant-garde, particularly in poetry and painting. George Albers was there, Charles Olson, the poet, was there, Mary Catherine Richards was there. What you may not know was that the college was actually founded explicitly to produce more democratic citizens and to model a new kind of community. John Anderson Rice, who was one of the first presidents, said, "Black Mountain was to be education for democracy. Its classrooms and community would need to model democratic processes. Art would provide the heat with which to forge a new kind of citizen. The democratic man, we said, must be an artist. The integrity, we said, of the democratic man was the integrity of the artist, an integrity of relationship." So I went and found a syllabus for a summer course in 1948. Guess what you could have done in 1948 if you'd been in summer school at Black Mountain College? Your music teacher, John Cage. Your dance teacher, Merce Cunningham. Your painting teacher, Willem de Kooning. Architecture, Buckminster Fuller. I mean, can you believe this layup? It's just incredible. But the thing, so that's all actually even reasonably familiar to scholars. What I didn't know was that in addition to those courses, you would have taken two social sciences. One, culture and personality anthropology, designed to help you understand how character and governance were related. And the other, a course in international relations with a member of the United Nations. Art was to be the forge that produced the democratic person. So Cage spent the summer there in 48 with his sweetheart and partner, Merce Cunningham. You can see Buckminster Fuller here on stage with Merce. There's Buckminster Fuller with an early model of the dome, a geodesic dome in round with a dancer in front of it. Simply an incredible time, just an amazing time. And it was a time when Cage continued his assault on things European and on traditional music. In 1948, he gave this sort of famous lecture in which he said that music Music now needed to be understood not as Beethoven understood it, Beethoven the German. Music, he said, is a problem parallel to that of the integration of the personality, which in terms of modern psychology is the co-being of the conscious and the unconscious mind, law and freedom in a random world situation. Good music can act as a guide to good living. My point here is that in 1948, Cage's musical agenda shared the psychological agenda of the propaganda enterprise. Cage came back in 1952 with Cunningham to Black Mountain College, and in that year they staged the first happening. Now let me just ask, how many of you have been to a happening? Oh, I love it. I'm like, yeah, I know. Well, not all the old timers, only the hippest of the old timers. Okay, yeah. So a happening. Well, I won't go into happenings in general. I'll go to the first happening in 1952. 1952, Cage plays some music on the piano. Cunningham moves around a bit. A dog runs through the room. Somebody climbs a ladder. MC Richards reads some poetry, and at the end, they put cups on chairs. So you may wonder what was such a big deal. At the time, it was seen as a performance of a democratic surround, an environment in which random events are scattered, surrounding you, and you are fully in charge of your experience. It's all up to you. You are the strong, perceptually independent democratic citizen, collaborating with others in some kind of otherwise random experience. You make sense of it. Cage then moved to New York, and in 1957, 58, he taught courses in experimental music to a whole generation of artists who became the founders of the happening in the 1960s. These are people like Alan Capro, or George Higgins, Stan Vanderbeek, the people who built the happenings that broke open the art world of the 1960s. Simply incredible. Those happeners, in turn, helped create this. This is 1966. It's an exhibition at the Riverside Museum in New York, and it's the first thing that I can find historically called a be-in. A be-in. A multimedia place just to be yourself. To be. And through the multimedia surrounding you, to realize that you're not alone. Rather, you're part of a collectivity in America and in the world as a whole. The word be-in got picked up by the press, and they began to use it across the 1960s. This is a poster for the show. What I want to show you is that the imagery and the language, we are all one, we are all one. We think of that as 60s language, but it's actually late 40s language at the very least. It's the language of universal humanism. It's the language of post-war America saying we're all one. Under the American gaze, we're all one. Democratic countries everywhere, even near the Soviet Union. But it's that vision. It's that vision. Anyhow, the word be-in gets used in Life magazine, and then it's everywhere. Fall of '66, we have the first be-in, and then in January 1967, we have the human be-in in Golden Gate Park, which kicks off the highest part of the '60s, helps spark the Summer of Love that summer. It's the event that leads people to sing things like, you know, if you're going to San Francisco, put a flower in your hair, okay? This is where that starts. At one level, this is the happy ending to the story I've been telling. The pushback against fascism in the 1940s leads to a radical re-individualization of American society toward the efflorescence of new kinds of collectivities that are free and open and putting flowers in their hair. I would much rather live in this world than I would rather live in the world of Camp Siegfried, you know? It's amazing. And I kind of wish that I could stop there. But I can't. There's a problem. There's a couple of problems. On the one hand, the democratic surround is an enormously powerful alternative in its own moment to fascism. To the hierarchy, to the top-down manipulation, to just the brutality of fascism. This multi-screen, select yourself, pictures on the ceiling, pictures on the floor kind of world is a wonderful alternative to this. Now, I don't want to deny that. And it's one that American citizens at the time perceive as an alternative. From our own vantage point, though, it emerges as something else. I would argue that the democratic surround marks not only a turn away from mass media and mass-mediated fascism, but a turn toward a new managerial society. I love this picture. This is the family of man at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in the mid-50s. What I love about this picture is that inside this space, these people perceive themselves as free. They are the democratic surround ideal. They move individually together. They are surrounded by images. They can pick and choose the images they see. They can move freely in relation to them. But we can see from up above that they're working in sort of a Potemkin village. It's a village in which there's a backstage. Somebody out there is setting these images. Somebody is setting the terms by which these people can imagine themselves as free. And I'm afraid that's where we live now. We live now in a world in which we are surrounded by screens, hyper-individualized, offered the opportunity to connect with one another, but always in terms that are set by distant or not so distant others. And that's a very powerful place to be. I want to end with a sentence from Margaret Mead, with whom I fell in love, which seems to have happened to everyone who ever knew her, or certainly with whom she collaborated. Margaret Mead, leader of the Committee for National Morale, she said in 1942, "Were the world we dream of attained, members of that new world would be so different from ourselves that they would no longer value it in the same terms in which we now desire it. We would no longer be at home in such a world. We who have dreamed it could not live in it." We live in it, and we have to figure out how to do it better. Thank you. Thanks. Great. Questions? Go for it.
Susan.
This is fabulous. I feel like I just sat through a Stanford lecture. It's
Well, thank you.
wonderful.
You kind of did.
And you didn't say anthropologists, which a lot of those people were.
No, I'm sorry. I missed that. What did you say?
So Margaret Mead, among others that you mentioned, Gregory, anthropologists. Anyway, so I just, since it's not mass media, maybe you don't have a comment on it, but I wonder if you have thoughts about flash mobs.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about flash mobs. Thank you for asking. I want to touch on flash mobs in a slightly different context. I think one of the negative legacies from this period is a legacy that we live with every day now, and it is the notion, sort of bastardized from these guys, that if we just get together and express our opinions, the world will change. Right? I call it the expressivist fallacy. It's a fallacy where if I'm just me more publicly, things will change. Now, that's not so bad in a flash mob, right? Like, fine, flash mob, it comes, it goes, life's all right. It's terrible when it's Occupy. So I have a really, this may be a little painful for some folks in the room. My politics run very far to the left, and I want to say that before I take a shot at Occupy. I think Occupy has failed us precisely because it bought into the expressivist fallacy, that if we simply come together as freestanding individuals and stand together at the foot of Wall Street, things will change. While we've been doing that, the Tea Party has been nicely organizing, building out of churches, organizing political parties so as to work against the system. One of the legacies from the period that I'm chronicling that is a negative legacy is the sort of super individuation of politics. If I just get my personality right, if my working on my personality together with you working on your personality is enough to make a democracy, and then we can get together in some expressive space, live via a flash mob or online, express our difference, and the world will change. It won't. It won't.
Yes, she has a follow-up.
Yes, go right ahead.
So then do you have a comment about Pussy Riot?
I love Pussy Riot. I'd marry any one of them. I love Pussy Riot. They are just the best. So I'm not trying to say all expressive politics are bad, okay, by any means, or that they're ineffective. I think Pussy Riot's amazing. Pussy Riot is a start, but Pussy Riot isn't going to get anywhere until somebody in this, until somebody in the Soviet Union or Russia now musters the institutional wherewithal to bring guns and money to bear on Putin. Changing consciousness is part of the process, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. Otherwise, Pussy Riot all the way.
I would love to, Bart Renner, I would love to know what you think about the proliferation of irony and its impact on this structure as we're living it now.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So one of my favorite scholars is a guy who's coming to Pomona next year named Mark Andreevich. He's written a lot on irony and what he calls the savvy viewer. And what he argues, and I'm just going to say what he argues because I agree with it. What he argues after studying it a lot is that in a condition in which you are institutionally relatively powerless, yet see the wrongs going on around you, and this is the hardest part, kind of enjoy the media you're getting while that's being done to you, what you end up with as a possible form of action is snark. Snark is an available strategy for managing the simultaneously being oppressed and pleased, right? And I mean, so that's, and I think that's a challenge a lot of us face right now. We encounter media in which we are pleased but oppressed at the very same moment, and it's, I mean, I don't know, you must have guilty viewing pleasures, I certainly do. Those guilty pleasures, that's snark. I think it's a measure also of our inability to organize. You know, it astonishes me, and this is again one of the things that I think of as the negative legacy of these folks. There's no call for institutional action here. There's no call for unions here. There's calls for getting your head together in the 60s term, right? Surrounding yourself with media, being a better individual. I think if you do that, if you really take that seriously, then the only weapon you have against organized forces is irony. And that's not a satisfying weapon. One other thing about this story that I want to tell in this context is that in the 1940s, the Democratic Surround was seen as a radically anti-racist, radically pro-Semitic environment. It was an environment in which you could imagine yourself a citizen with others very different than yourself. In today's network-driven expressivist environment, I think it's become a commonplace to connect with others like yourself. There's no incentive to reach out across those boundaries, nor are there any of the things that it takes to actually do that, right? So I'm not religious, but I go to church, you know, about once a month. Why do I go to church? Well, because in church, I meet people who are from different classes, different races, different regions, with whom I can do stuff that I value. It's very hard to meet those folks other places, certainly not online. I mean, you know, I could talk my politics all day long. I can call NPR, you know, Great. Oh, there's the microphone, yeah, oh, two microphones, sorry, my bad, hang on. Okay, great, thank you. Hi.
Hi. So did you also in your research come across any of the propaganda and radio broadcasts and also lots and lots and lots of magazines? It's like Stars and Stripes. Did you analyze any of that?
Sure, I saw a lot of that, and you know, I analyzed some of it. What I'm proudest of in this book is actually some of the stuff that I cut out, and that's some of the stuff that I cut out. I also cut out a very long section at the beginning on 19th century fears of the mob. And you can be grateful that I did that, really. Okay. What I found with both of those sections was that other people had done it better than I could. And so I kind of give just enough to give a sense of how this is different, but I don't go deep on it. And I can point you to books that do. I just realized that I wasn't doing it any better than they were already doing it.
Sorry, follow on.
Sure.
I just have a personal history. My uncle, my great uncle, was shot out of a B-25 aircraft over Egypt, and it was interesting reading his account. And theoretically, there was a radio broadcast about it, but it made it sound like, oh, what fun! I survived. You know, right. It was harrowing, though. The poor dude. Right, you know, but they didn't go into any of that stuff.
Yeah. So the guy who taught me how to fish, my surrogate father, was a Marine who had been on Iwo Jima. And you know, I was really intimate with this guy. This guy would tell me, he told me all the stuff guys are supposed to tell guys, okay? So I asked him one day, I was 16, I asked him one day, what was it like at Iwo Jima? And he said, it was tough. Okay then. You know, and I think that was the impact of that post-war propaganda push, yeah. Yeah, oh great, go for it.
So I have a question about pushback. It seems that over the whole time you were talking about, there was the House Un-American Activities Committee, there was Richard Nixon, there was Kent State, there was not FDR, what's his name?
Hoover?
The FBI, yeah, Herbert,
yeah.
J. Edgar Hoover.
J. Edgar, yes, right, sorry.
Yeah, and so you know, in one way, I want to ask you about that pushback, and so how influential was that in sort of putting the brakes on all of this, or did it? Right. Or maybe it even spurred it. It's hard to know. But then that actually made me think about sort of more of the Chomskyan analysis, which is this all doesn't matter. That is that there was a huge corporate machine working the whole time, and this little stuff that you're talking about was just a little bubble on the top, and it's still a little bubble.
Great. Okay. So let me answer this. Great. Okay. So I think one of the things that surprised me when I was in the material, particularly inside the USIA stuff and inside the Mead papers, the Margaret Mead papers, where I spent 2 weeks at the Smithsonian in Washington, was how much debate and flexibility and doubt there was in the moment. I think that there was. I think that we tell ourselves a story now, thanks largely to the work of a generation of historians that came of age in the late 60s and started publishing in the 80s. We tell ourselves a story that says the defining events of the 50s were HUAC, the oppressive moments of McCarthy, and that we finally broke free of that in the 1960s or through civil rights in the 50s. That's a story that has obviously a lot of truth to it, but it's by no means the only story. And the worlds that they're describing and pointing to in Washington are infinitely more complex than that. There were people on all sides of the intellectual fence at the very moment that McCarthy was pushing. McCarthy is very visible to us now, but was by no means the central figure in that era. What I think surprised me was how much even people who are seen as oppressive, like Eisenhower, were in fact very open to all kinds of ideas. Eisenhower gave a speech at Columbia in '54 where he described the different psychological states of oppressed peoples in the East and Americans. He did it very thoughtfully, very openly. Margaret Mead herself was an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. One of the places this became clearest to me was in the sexual politics of the period. Many of the people in my book are either homosexual or polysexual, and very out about it. And it's very interesting to me because they're widely known. Their partners are widely known. They go out to dinner together. Merce Cunningham and John Cage go everywhere together, but no one asks, right? And other people are suffering predations around them. I don't really know what to do with that except to say that it's a much more mixed story. On the corporate piece, this is really important. I was surprised at how relatively weak American corporations were in some senses during the war. And they actually, post-war, we lived in a moment when Americans were so universalist and so pro-humanist that in 1948, they were willing to, the majority of Americans were willing to turn over control of the American military to the UN. I mean, imagine that now, right? That's not a corporatist world. That's really a different humanist world. The corporatist world comes back, though. It comes back starting, I believe, in about '56 with something called the People's Capitalism Campaign. In that period, we were very afraid that the people's communism and people's socialism in the Soviet Union is actually winning. We're afraid of that. So a group of American corporate leaders, the National Advertising Association, whose name I forget, and a group of intellectuals connected to the Committee for National Morale, some of them a guy named Potter at Yale, gather together and launch a campaign called the People's Capitalism Campaign. They build an exhibition in Grand Central Station. They do a whole series of things overseas. That's the beginning of the gradual weeding out of the politics that drove the Democratic surround in the 40s, the anti-racist, pro-sexual diversity politics that really are very vivid and very public, at least until 50-51. That campaign begins to merge the aesthetics of selection on which democracy depends in the 40s with the aesthetics of selection associated with consumption. So that by the time we get to 59, to be a Democrat in the American model on display in America, in the American National Exhibition, is not to be making political choices about race or egalitarian choices, rather it's to be buying the right things. And that's, I think, the other piece of this expressivist dilemma that I think we find ourselves in now. I think that when we want to express ourselves, we can express ourselves in language, but we can also express ourselves through purchasing. And I think, my daughter, I have a teenage daughter, she's 19, she talks a lot about her style, as if that's a meaningful category for her, which is fascinating to me, right? Because for her, that's almost like a political statement. It seems to her to be part of her politics. That's, I think, the consequence of the corporate predation that you're describing. I've never agreed with Chomsky that it's class warfare from the get-go. The documents that I've read don't support that view, in my view. Go for it.
All right.
Yeah. Hey.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on sort of physical bodies and how they play into all of this, because I'm looking at this picture you have here of people at a consumer fair.
Yeah.
And I've been to sort of many tech fairs where it's assumed everyone in the audience is sort of this white, cis, het male who's there primarily as a consumer.
Yep.
Whereas, thinking about something like Occupy,
Right.
being there physically sort of is an incredibly different experience
Right.
where bodily expression is emphasized. Smells are an incredible part of it, of course, being
Yes.
at Occupy. But it's really about sort of one as a citizen, an embodied citizen, as opposed to a disembodied consumer.
Well, so I want to shift one piece of of your articulation with which I otherwise agree. I wouldn't say embodied citizen, I'd say embodied subject. But I want to make the distinction because it's important, right? Absolutely agree that these are figured as largely white, largely male, consumer engineer citizens. Okay. The environments that I've studied are environments for the production of a particular kind of subjectivity, a particular way of looking at the world. And the body is a mechanism through which to do that work. It's very Foucauldian, right? So my perceptions are ways into my body, and my felt sensation, my feeling of freedom in the museum space is designed to help me practice in my body the particular mode of freedom that the people who designed the space want me to experience. That mode of freedom is, in the early 40s in many ways, anti-racist, deracinated in an anti-racist sense. So what you're picking up on here is the total white maleness of the world. I totally get that. I get it in so many ways. In the 40s, that universal humanist impulse actually has a very different valence. It's very much like, wow, we're all different, but we're all equal. Ruth Benedict, one of Margaret Mead's teachers and sweethearts, wrote a book about the politics of race that was a bestseller in 1940. No one remembers it. It's an attack on racism, and it argues that your body is ultimately not so different from mine, which is an argument that we now find oppressive, because it's the failure to recognize difference that we see as the problem. In their time, it was the overemphasis on difference. They saw difference as the Nazi thing, right? So one last factoid. 1938, the English language edition of the Nazi Primer comes out in the US. It's the handbook for the Hitler Youth, essentially. It's like the Boy Scout handbook for Nazis. The first sentence of that book is, the foundation of the National Socialist outlook on life is the unlikeness of men, meaning difference. So what you're flagging is a kind of historical transformation, a kind of political neutering of these spaces, and a kind of consumerist evacuation of their political intent. But what you're also flagging is a shift in this critique of diversity, right? The universalism that we would flag generationally as an all-white male, pro-white male thing was, in a different time, a much more egalitarian force. I say that, of course, as a tall white male. But
I'm intrigued by your phrase, the ethics of selection.
Mm-hmm.
Think of selection as the stuff's been given to me, and what I do is pick it out. So my role is to pick it out,
Yeah.
but it's been given to me.
Yep.
Given that that's sort of happened, and I sort of would have a feeling that that's what happened to music. You can't play it, it's too complicated, you got to select it.
Mm-hmm.
What has this done to the ethics of construction, of pushing it back in, of here we are in Silicon Valley, which prides itself on building stuff.
Right. Oh man, I wish I had an answer as good as that question. I'm not gonna. I'm of multiple minds, right? Because I actually asked my class, I have a class called Digital Media and Society where I asked the students more or less that question. And one of them said to me, well, the problem with the things that Silicon Valley is producing is that it's producing aggregation systems that work sort of on this line, right? So you're in a sense constantly reproducing the dominant powers that you're trying to escape by making art in the first place. So my student said that to me. Another student says the answer to that is promote the individual genius, and digital media systems do that. They allow individual geniuses to reach out across. I don't see that. The only answer I've got, and it's a terrible answer, is that attention and aesthetics are now politicized more deeply than ever, and the only way to find a way to speak back to them is to step outside them for a while. It's to put the screens down. It's the only way to find the...
What about the maker movement?
So I think the maker movement, I thought a lot about that. So I learned this with the hippies. I would call them vernacular technologists, vernacular ideologists. I think the maker movement is a chance to practice in a low-key, low-cost, vernacular way the skills that at a much higher cost, much higher technological capability way are driving our economy. I think you can play with power when you're a maker?
I'm reminded to ask you to tell the Andy Warhol story.
Boy, silly me. Okay, fine.
You planted
I
that
know,
at dinner,
I
and
did
it's
that. I
coming
did, and now
back.
it's coming back. Okay, so we were thinking about microphones moving around the room. So my book ends in a fairly helpful way on these multimedia environments. You know, they've lost their politics, but they're still a lot of fun. In 1966, Andy Warhol kicks into gear with a very different kind of multimedia environment, and he challenged this world. I thought Andy Warhol built multimedia environments that had this kind of politics to them. On the contrary, 1966, Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground were hired as the entertainment for the annual New York City Psychiatrists Association convention. Yeah, it's just great. You cannot make this stuff up. And it's a black tie dinner. The psychiatrists are almost exclusively male. They bring their wives. Wives wearing evening gowns. They're served dinner. It's at a big hotel. Andy waits out front as they come in, showing different things from his films behind him. He's shaking hands. He's greeting. He's being very friendly, warm Andy. He goes in. They show some films. They start serving. They serve asparagus. They serve beef. All this is recorded by a New York Times writer who's there. And then suddenly, the Velvet Underground come on. And the Velvet Underground are wearing black leather boots. And they sing, leather, leather, shiny black leather. Okay, now, in our time, right, leather, maybe it's a bondage thing. I don't know. It's leather, right? It doesn't have the resonance. In 1966, 20 years after World War II, during which the Nazis wore shiny, shiny boots of black leather, oh my God, at a psychiatrist convention, which can be presumed to be substantially Jewish in makeup? Okay, this is incredible. So then they go up on stage, and they start dancing, and one of them, Gerard Malanga, starts cracking a whip. Okay, shiny, shiny boots of black leather, cracking a whip. Then, this is where the microphone thing comes in. I should never have said this to you at dinner, Nancy. Two filmmakers, Jonas Mekas and Barbara Rose, run through the audience. Jonas Mekas, yeah, Jonas Mekas, yeah, nut job, huh? Yeah. It's so nice to be in a room with people who know some of these figures. So Jonas Mekas and Barbara Rose run through the audience with a camera and a microphone live, recording them, shouting obscenities and asking obscene questions of the psychiatrists. And I won't repeat the questions because they are that obscene, but they are obscene questions about their personal lives. And so the Velvet Underground at that time was called the Uptight. And afterwards, a reporter asked, I think it was Nico, who you know from the Velvet Underground records, why they were called the Uptight. He said, well, we think people are uptight, and we want to shock them out of that. And that's a very different kind of aesthetic than what we're seeing here. This is not a shock aesthetic. This is a figure yourself out within the space that I give you aesthetic. So this may be another answer to your question. It would be Andy Warhol's answer. Don't do this, shock. Get outside, get outside. I have one other answer. It's actually from my counterculture book, but I'll raise it anyways. And it's sort of an SDS New Left answer. When I look back at the 60s, my first book was actually about how Americans remember the Vietnam War. I spent a lot of time thinking about the 60s. There were communalists and there were people who marched and tried to organize parties, and my heart is with those who tried to organize parties, and political parties and make political change. And I wish increasingly that we could do that. And one of the things that I offer as a challenge to people who work in the Valley is how do you do politics in a world where the people who run the companies that you may or may not work for argue that the building technology is itself sufficient for politics? Google's changing the world. Why do politics? I have an answer to that question, but I'll save it.
So I guess my question is, at the end of your slideshow, you kind of left off with this idea of freedom within constraints.
Yep.
And I think that's a very powerful concept. I think it's Chomsky actually who talks about how what's basically happened in modern times is that there's a very lively debate within a very narrow range.
Oh, that's good, yeah. Yep.
And so, I guess my question is, how do we expand that range? How do we push those constraints? How do you move beyond?
Great. So I've thought a lot about that. So I'm going to take refuge and just apologize because I'm an academic and a historian, and I'm in that ridiculously privileged position where I get to think about stuff, critique stuff, and go home. Okay, so I just want to flag that and say that I know that before I do what I'm about to do. I think the answer actually is something that I see when I go to Glide Memorial up in San Francisco. It's we need to build institutions that have low-key, persistent points of contact between people who are very different than one another, where they do things together for the greater good. We need not just a third space in the classic great good sense where we sit still and ponder our wonderfulness, but where we do things together. It has to be persistent, it has to be low-key. I think that really makes a huge difference. So my daughter, we live in Mountain View. My daughter tutored, she's in college now, but she tutored for a couple of years in the Mountain View school system, tutored Mexican-American kids English. And she started it because she's just interested in tutoring, wanted to see what that would be like. Over those 2 years, she got a totally different view of her community. She went on to drop French and learn Spanish. She began to see her community as including folks of all different colors, all different classes. And she had that experience simply because it was very low-key. Every week she went to tutor, and all the other stuff came in. That happens to me at church, right? Again, I repeat, I'm not a particularly religious person, but if I go to church, right, I can go through a worship setting and then chat with people who are from very different classes, very different worlds, all around me, and we just kind of get to know each other in a really low-key way. Maybe we'll serve a dinner, or maybe we'll do a thing. That matters. So I think that's my answer. Organizing is really, really, really key.
So everyone should go to Glide.
That's actually true. Thank you.
I'm serious.
Yeah, it's an amazing experience. Thanks, yeah. Oh, great, yeah, I couldn't see the mic. Yeah, hi.
Hi, Garrett Dorman.
Hi.
The driving motivation, I think that you were saying, was that democratization comes by people with whole personalities being able to make choice.
Yes, that's how my subjects believe. I don't know that I believe that, but
Right.
they believe that, yeah.
So I'm wondering, in some ways today, because the technological platforms by these technology institutions, there's more choice than ever. We can go to a Spotify and listen to almost any music you want. And the music that it doesn't get to Spotify, you can go to the local artist's own webpage and listen to it. Then there's artists, I don't know, in Ai Weiwei, who are outside the American culture, who seem to be extending maybe that philosophy. I'm wondering, you were saying today that there's this limit because the corporations are giving us what we can choose from. But on the other hand, we have these platforms by which there's so much more choice than ever before. Is there a contradiction there?
There is a contradiction there. Thanks for flagging it.
Sure.
So I think maybe I need to amend my claim, and only insofar as to say that the world of the internet is not as totalizing as the exhibition spaces that I've described here, and that I'm being unfair to the internet when I suggest that it's somehow identical with the Family of Man show. It's not as closely managed as that. But I don't think I'm being completely unfair. Now let me make the other side of the case. Two elements that really stand out in the American internet. One is how much of what's actually produced and accessed on a regular basis is driven by the same corporate players that have driven mass media. So my students and I monitor this really pretty closely, and a lot of what we see is in the blogosphere particularly is echoes of stuff that's dropped into the discussion sphere by the New York Times, by other organizations. I know from my own personal experience, if you get interviewed by one of about a half a dozen publications, you're going to pop up on blog sites all around the world with what you just did for that publication. So there's still a structure in there. That's all I'm trying to say about that. Second piece that I think is really important is that the design of the websites themselves has power. So Eva Illouz is one of my favorite writers. She wrote a book called Cold Intimacies, which has a very powerful section on online dating sites. And what she points out is that to use an online dating site, which you would argue, I think, gives you enormous access to an incredible range of people you might not otherwise ever meet or get to know, you have to essentially produce yourself in terms that are visible to the site. You have to do a profile, you have to do a picture, you have to fill out a long questionnaire. A lot of the ways that we interact with the internet require those kinds of self-production. So that even to get at Ai Weiwei, I need to enter a space in which I fill out certain menus, engage in certain ways, imagine myself in relation to a star artist. That's not, it's not a completely closed system, but I wouldn't argue that it's completely open either. And I think particularly here in the Valley, we're so aware of the choices that we're creating that we're perhaps less aware of the ways that the architecture we're building shapes and in some sense governs those choices.
You remind me of, for me, a new discovery was a new search engine called A Million Short.
Never seen A Million Short? I'm remembering.
It's called A Million Short,
Okay.
and the idea is they basically will do a Google search for you, but they'll remove the top 1,000,000 sites.
Oh, I love that.
And their logo is, if you remove the top 1,000,000 sites, what will you find?
That's brilliant.
Which is, I think, kind of getting at what you're talking about. that
Absolutely.
We are dominated by the certain big sites,
Yeah.
and this is a chance to maybe see the little guys out there.
No, I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think your point again resonates right through this discussion. You know, where is creation in this? What has creation become? You know, is it just two turntables and a microphone where I take other people's records and spin them? You know, I mean, is Beck the ideal? I don't know. You know, I don't know. I don't know.
I wouldn't mind a feature directed by Beck.
Fair enough. Yeah, yeah. I would. Yeah, I used to think I wouldn't mind one managed by the Velvet Underground, but.
Yeah, I just wanted
Oh, yeah,
to.
great.
I'm sorry.
I just couldn't see you. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about something that sort of the way I like to perceive this whole change that we've been going through lately with internet, let's say, in that it turned, let's say, the country, I don't know about the world, but at least the country, into a lot more like what a big city used to be like. In the sense that it used to be if you lived in a big, you know, if you lived in New York, you could find people who had similar interests, you could organize.
Yeah.
It wasn't in itself, it didn't mean that if you lived in New York, you would naturally organize yourselves. And that's maybe speaking to your point about you know, that just having the environment in itself does not automatically make people do that. But it does offer those opportunities that people, you know, if two people like to play squash, they're much more likely to find it, to find squash partners there than if, you know, there are two people who like squash but happen to live in two small towns and don't know about each other.
Right. So I have a couple thoughts about that. One is that the people we're talking about have to be technologically capable, reasonably well educated, and have access to sufficient funds to buy a computer. And you know, I worked with a foster family for 4 years that lived in Morgan City, and first in Mountain View, then moved to Morgan City, and Morgan Hill, not Morgan City, sorry, Morgan Hill. And I used to work in a town called Morgan City, Morgan Hill. They could pay the rent. They had jobs. They had a really deeply crappy computer, and you know, almost no clue how to download or manage information from intellectual milieus other than the one they already inhabited. And that really taught me a lesson, because they should have been the test case, right? They should be, you know, they're in Mountain View. I live next door to them. I help them with their computing. I work with the kid on his homework. Mountain View school system's amazingly supportive. Morgan Hill was really good too. They should have been the test case, and they couldn't do it. I come from a rural area. In the rural area where I grew up, you know, sure, there are people who have a kind of cosmopolitan knowledge of the world. But there are an awful lot of people who are fourth-generation farmers, and they just have no engagement with that larger world. And even if they did, it wouldn't be meaningful beyond certain, you know, prices for milk and prices for corn. And you know, I just try to say that it's a much more differentiated landscape than we think out there. The other thing that I want to say is that there's a wonderful book called Out in the Country by Mary Gray, a fabulous scholar now working for Microsoft. Out in the Country is a study of rural gay teens and the ways that they use new media. And it turns out in the populations she studied, which were mostly in Kentucky, that rural gay teens cruised in two ways, online and at Walmart, which I kind of loved, right? Walmart as the public space in rural Kentucky.
Walmart is the Marina Safeway.
Oh, is that yeah? Cool. That's great. That's great. Yeah, I didn't know. But I've come to think from that book that identity work is something that the internet supports very well. Political work, the work of institutions, the work of coming together face to face, or not even face to face, but coming together and doing low-key, low barrier to entry social work together over time. I haven't seen the internet support that well. And the places that I've looked at that made the claim that it was supporting that, like Obama's campaign, turned out to be doing something very, very different. I defer to the talking stick.
Which was actually a question I was thinking of asking you about 2008 and what was happening with all that. How do you analyze that in the terms?
So I'm very lucky. My first top to bottom PhD student was a guy named Daniel Kreis, who's now a professor at University of North Carolina, who wrote his dissertation on Obama's 2004-2008 campaign and its new media use. And he went into it fully believing that the Obama campaign, like the Dean campaign before, was a genuinely open source campaign, that it was a bottom-up driven campaign. What he found was something entirely different. What he found was a team of extraordinarily committed democratic activists, technicians and technologists developing a hyper-centralized database to measure and monitor the voting population, to identify its characteristics and map them in ways that rendered them available for targeting for door-to-door campaigning. What they built was essentially an incredibly effective targeting centralized database.
We had a presentation here about that.
Oh, great. Oh, wow. I wish I'd seen that. That would have been great. Yeah. But they marketed it as an open source campaign, and that was the beauty of it, right? And that's something that we see in tech worlds a lot. We see this at Google all the time. We see network technologies being marketed to us as tools of liberation, even as the people who are making them are making their money from turning them into tools of monitoring.
Yeah, part of the charm is really the expressivist characteristic of it.
Right. Or the imagination that we're being expressive.
Yeah,
You know, when I go to a meetup, right? I remember when I went to an Obama meetup, I felt so powerful. I was like, wow, he gave me the tools to meet my other Obama-esque neighbors. I'm psyched. Well, and I'm still psyched about that, but I wasn't, now I get emails from Barack like every week, right? Not every day. I'm not in that camp. I get Michelle once a month and Barack once a week.
Do you think that that is a part of the disembodied, individualized screen interface as opposed to a more communal, face-to-face, person-to-person?
I think bodies matter enormously, but bodies aren't enough. This gets back to your question. So the counterculture book that I did has a lot about communes in it. And people believed that in the 60s they could come together on communes and by being in the same place together with their bodies, develop a shared mindset, a shared consciousness, and leave government behind. That view, I think, also infects the American left today, and it's a problem. I don't think bodies alone are enough. I think bodies need to gather together to build persistent institutions. And I think institutions are the answer. Institutions are boring. They're lousy entertainment. I mean, who wants to watch like a TV show about a hospital? Well, hospitals actually probably want the DMV. Okay. In some ways, the DMV is a utopia. Okay, I know that sounds perverse, but think about it, right? When you're standing at the DMV, that's one place where you're going to meet everybody in your town, and you're going to do something together. Well, no, okay, well, it is. Well, how?
Try jury duty.
Jury duty, great, perfect, great. Jury duty, excellent example. That's great. Jury duty. I was once asked to define utopia, and I said hospital. I know it's a twisted thing, but it's because that's a world where everyone has a role. People are committed to moving forward together on a pro-social project. Funding is distributed according to the outcome. I mean, it's in some ways a very fair and open world. Jury duty, great, thank you.
What are the effects of episodic expressivism? I'm thinking of things like annual Burning Man.
Oh, okay, so I've written on Burning Man. My most cited paper is a paper called Burning Man at Google, which is about the role of the Burning Man Festival in the engineering culture of Google. I would argue that Burning Man and periodic expressivism connected to the Valley is to the Valley what Protestant churches were to Max Weber's industrial America or industrial world. You know, Max Weber's Protestant churches were places where people would on Sunday rehearse the social norms by which the factory was governed Monday through Saturday. You know, the owners would sit up front, workers would sit out back, we would all worship together in carefully arrayed rows. So I go to Burning Man, and what do I see in Burning Man? I see intense, technologically savvy teams collaborating on projects to build amazing technocentric art and to check each other out while they do it. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like, any old engineering company, really, in some ways, right? Like, I got my project, what's yours doing, Like, oh, check it out. Can you make your thing do this? Yeah. You know what I mean? And so, I think the difference for Burning Man, I interviewed a lot of engineers who go to Burning Man. What they told me was, when I go to Burning Man, I can totally focus on the project with a team that I share total values, beliefs with, and together we can achieve a kind of flow state that I never quite get at work. And I realized that Burning Man is a place where people's expression of themselves melts together with what I ended up calling in the paper vocational ecstasy, a kind of ecstatic experience of vocational ideals that they can't have in the workplace because they're working on other people's stuff. And there's all the politics of the workplace are the workplace, right? But at Burning Man, they can practice it. And so I think Burning Man is a religious organization equivalent in our time for digital media industries to the Protestant church in Max Weber's time.
I'm going to declare this the last question, but I want to remind the audience that we still have a few books down front, which I will be happy to sell to you.
And I will sign books happily. They make great gifts. I'm happy to report that though the theme is academic, the writing is not. Okay, if you have a parent, a friend, a loved one who lived through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, memory lane. Okay. But no, so I'll stick around and sign books and chat happily too. You don't have to buy a book to chat. So who gets the last question? Ah, yes.
I do.
Great.
I just finished Kern's book, The Bully Pulpit, talking about how Roosevelt used the press in a creative way and in an influential way.
Yeah.
And then I thought about how Ellsberg used the press. And now I'm thinking about Snowden. And I wonder, what's your take on where this is going?
Oh boy, I don't know. I don't have one, except that I think that Snowden is a wonderful reminder for a generation that hasn't had to need one yet, that states and others monitor them and have their own ambitions for them. And digital media, like other media, render them available to the state in new ways. And folks like Snowden or Ellsberg can, I think, for the greater good, use the press to reveal that. And we're living with a generation that hasn't realized that it needs to have that revealed. And it does. I asked my students, right? I have 100 students in my digital media society class. I said, how many of you have read the Facebook licensing agreement? You know, you're right, the EULA, that's right, the EULA, the end user license agreement, 0. They're entering into contracts of which they have no knowledge. And they don't feel bad about it. What would Nixon do? Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Happy to sign books. Thank you.